provider of aid and credit for development. So that is a very important impression that we want to compete with China on quality. China already has the advantage of speed and scale. They were under the impression that they could offer a value proposition to developing countries by offering better quality. But guess what? The Chinese nervous system has learned and they have already adapted. And I can discuss later how they're going about doing it. Project offered by the World Bank takes almost 7 years just to get to commencement, not even completion, commencement. And then another 6 years or so on average to complete it.
Hello and welcome to InferTalks, a podcast where I put you in the room with some of the biggest thought leaders from around the world. Joining me today for a conversation is a renowned public policy expert and senior research scientist at Data, focusing on Chinese development finance program, Dr. Ammar Malik. Dr. Ammar Malik, welcome to InferTalks.
Thank you.
Dr. Ammar, let's start our conversation. China's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, has become a vehicle for Chinese foreign policy. Let me ask you, despite the fact that, it's been criticized a lot in certain segments of the Western media as well, let me ask you a very critical question. How really true is the notion of the debt trap surrounding China's BRI projects?
This idea of debt trap and debt trap diplomacy probably originated in Indian media, but it took a life of its own when the Trump administration, starting in 2016-17, started to include this idea in their talking points. I remember John Bolton, who was the former national security advisor, made a big speech in Washington at one of the think tanks in which he basically explained this idea as having two parts. One is that developing countries are being trapped. In other words, they're being forced to take on all the debt that they do not want. They're being forced to take projects that they don't want. And the second part of this idea was that in the case of a non-payment, that China would then go and grab land, grab assets, and grab physical assets. And the truth is that our research and the research of many other Chinese Belt and Road experts around the world has shown that this is a myth, and that in reality, not only are developing countries lining up themselves to seek projects from China, including Pakistan and many others, China is not forcing them to take this money. They're coming to China. And also in the case of default, now we know through the supply of unredacted original loan agreements that Data has uncovered that the Chinese prefer cash collateral. They don't want to or don't have the provision to grab illiquid assets like ports and tunnels and bridges, because think about it, even if they were to grab these assets, it would be incredibly difficult for them to liquidate them or to manage these entities, which are not very well run.
Dr. Ammar, to simplify things, what exactly is a cash collateral?
This cash collateral is the idea that if, let's say, you're taking a $1 billion loan from China Exim Bank, instead of putting your collateral as the factory on which it is being used, you would put 5 to 10% of the face value of that project, in which case it's 50 to 100 million. You will put that in an escrow account, which is a simple cash holding account controlled by the bank that is giving you the loan. And in case you miss a payment, they can debit it at a moment's notice. In other words, as the borrower, you have relinquished your right over that money, and you promise that you will maintain that minimum balance in US dollar currency so that the bank can credit it at a moment's notice.
Let's come to some myth-busting findings as your recent report that you and your colleagues actually came up with. It's called Belt and Road Reboot. Could you walk us through some of the findings that you came as a result of this or while you were compiling this study or report?
This is a massive research effort that we at Data have undertaken over the last many years, but this particular report is a labor of love. We have worked on over 21,000 projects in 165 countries, worth over $1.3 trillion. For each project, we counted over 133 variables or attributes of the project. Here are some of the top line findings, which I hope that will change the conversation in Washington and around the world. The first myth that is very much being propagated since COVID-19, and there's many studies that have shown this, is that the Belt and Road is dead, that new commitments are falling down, activity levels have come down, and that China is basically in retreat. Our research, however, finds that when you combine all the official sector creditors, by the way, we have found that there are almost 800 Chinese official sector entities involved in Chinese development finance projects. When you combine all of them, China is still financing over $80 billion worth of projects around the world, which is a whole 20 billion more than what the United States is doing, and 8 or 9 billion more than what the World Bank is doing. So China is and remains the world's single largest provider of aid and credit for development. So that is a very important impression that we want to bust through this report, which is based on hard evidence. Second is that the impression that Chinese projects are of low quality, that they don't have good environmental, social, and governance safeguards in place, and that often they lead to environmental disasters and labor violations and other things. Now, what we have found is that while there was an iota of truth in that myth, that we found that 2/3 of BRI projects in the first 4 years of the Belt and Road, 2014 to 2018, they were having implementation problems. What we have uncovered now, again, through original unredacted loan agreements, is that at least on paper, the safeguards that Chinese creditors are now putting in place in these loan agreements are watertight. They're of high quality. So we found almost 60% of all projects committed in 2021 having high quality safeguards. And that creates a real problem for the US and other countries who have been trying to compete with China on quality. China already has the advantage of speed and scale. They were under the impression that they could offer a value proposition to developing countries by offering better quality. But guess what? The Chinese nervous system has learned and they have already adapted. And I can discuss later how they're going about doing it, but I think it's an important finding. And the third thing that you also have to remember is that even if there are projects with higher quality safeguards, China is now able to complete projects on average within 3 years. And a comparable project offered by the World Bank takes almost 7 years just to get to commencement, not even completion, commencement. And then another 6 years or so on average to complete it. So if you're a developing country leader, let's say you're a Nawaz Sharif looking at the world in 2013 or 2014, you know that if you sign projects with China, you will cut the ribbon before the next election. But if you sign a project with the World Bank, your predecessor or maybe his predecessor will be cutting the ribbon. So the value proposition that the Chinese are offering is very compelling.
Now, some of the myths that you've actually, busted along the way, and as you've discussed, what kind of implications could it really have for, US influence in the global polity?
That if you are the US government, this thing that I mentioned about environmental safeguards is creating a real conundrum, because on the one hand, you've been saying that China should do better quality projects. They should not do coal-fired power plants, for example. They need to improve environmental safeguards and social safeguards in place. And now that they've actually done it, and we're showing you that in loan contracts, they're actually putting this in writing officially, what do you do? Should the US encourage this and say, great job, China, keep doing it? Or should they push back against it? And if they do push back against it, that'll be pushing back against their own values that they've stood for and said for many years. The other thing that I found, another myth that China watchers often talk about, is that the Chinese system is incredibly fragmented. The right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, and that the Belt and Road is a haphazard set of projects that is being cobbled together because the government made a big announcement. However, what we found is that the Chinese nervous system, again, is working very well. When we look at soft power indicators, which are Gallup World Poll data on public opinion toward China, or media sentiment, or UN General Assembly voting alignment for elite alignment, what we found is that 2/3 of all Belt and Road projects in the late BRI era, just last 4 or 5 years, is directed towards countries which are competitive, or what we would call toss-up countries. And only 15% of the money is going to countries which are firmly in the US camp in terms of their elites or their publics liking the US more than they like China. And so what that tells me is that there is a nervous system in place through perhaps the embassies, through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where they're keeping an eye on how things are moving on a reputational front. And they are making these bets in terms of prioritizing countries that are better able to absorb this, or better able to respond to China's overtures, and therefore gain in this zero-sum game of great power competition. They're using BRI to gain influence. And that also is a myth that I hope that we are busting, that this is not a haphazard set of random projects. It's actually based on a strategy, and it's a very clear trend that we are seeing.
Now, Dr. Ammar Malik, you and your colleagues have been keeping, exceptional amount of data under a data project. Now, let me then ask you, what have you really seen in terms of the trends itself? Where do the Chinese seem to be, moving a lot of their, loans? What types of loans do you see, getting a lot of interest, or, perhaps really see actually being diverted towards, projects among the recipient states? Could you sort of, shed some light on that?
It's very interesting you asked this, Osama, but I'll take you back to 2008. It is very important to understand the origin story of the Belt and Road. I know the Belt and Road wasn't announced until 2013, but the biggest year-on-year increases that we saw coming out of China were actually in 2008, 2009. This was the time, if you remember, that the United States had undertaken what was known as quantitative easing. In other words, benchmark interest rates in the US had come down to almost zero. And all the money that the Chinese central bank had parked in US treasuries because of the trade surpluses that they run. China sells a lot more than it buys from the world. They earn a lot of dollars, and then they have to use those dollars for something. All that money was parked in US treasury bills in Washington. They pulled that money out and started to write these entrust agreements with their development banks and saying, go find us profitable projects. So on comes President Xi in 2013 and makes this big announcement that China is going to launch a global new initiative. And that trend that we start seeing with lots of infrastructure projects backed by the Chinese state went up and up and up. But by 2017, it had reached its peak around the world. And now what we are seeing is that because developing countries that took all of this debt, they are having trouble repaying those loans. So the action has now shifted away from big ticket infrastructure projects, and there is now an increase in renminbi denominated or yuan denominated short-term liquidity injections, which means that they're giving deposits like they've given to Pakistan, they've given currency swaps, and helping countries stay afloat. They're basically saying, I know that you're having trouble repay the loans that you had taken from me and others. Here is some cash injection. Please use this to repay the loans that you had taken on. But until you get your house in order, we will not give you any big infrastructure projects. So there's really been a rise in RMB denominated short-term loans and a fall in infrastructure lending, which is typically done in US dollars. And I think that has profound implications on the global economic system. Just take one fact. 80% of the portfolio of China that we have looked at in our data set, 80% of this is in countries which are officially in debt distress. And 55% of all of these loans that China has given out are now due for repayment. And this number is going to go up to 75%. So China is basically looking at a $1 trillion debt collection effort. And as we like to say at Data, China is now officially the world's largest debt collector. And debt collectors don't win.
But what would happen in such a situation? How difficult would it be for China itself to go along that effort? Are you sort of suggesting that with interventions like these that you just mentioned right now, would it sort of make it easier for China until recipient states sort of get their house in order to go forward with repaying their old commitments?
This is $1 million question, Osama, but so far the indications are that the Chinese approach is to go it alone and try to cut deals with countries who are defaulting or about to default or struggling to repay their debts by going bilaterally to them. Zambia is a good example of that. Sri Lanka, we've seen the same thing. The deal was made by China directly, and now other creditors are coming in line. What's basically happened, Osama, is that all the G7 countries, the richest donors from the West, had set up this thing called the Paris Club, which is a group of creditors. And when a country was having trouble repaying loans, the Paris Club would come together and they would together negotiate. So if they were going to take haircuts, which is basically a loss on a loan, they would do it together in the same proportion. China, however, is not part of the Paris Club. They have consistently refused to be part of the Paris Club because they think that the terms are unfair and that they are a new player on the block. And therefore, they're also learning to deal with this crisis. And it is yet to be seen how they can deal with it. So far, they're not coordinating with the Paris Club, but they're they are standing behind the IMF. On repeated occasions, we've seen Chinese officials make statements, and we saw this playing out in Pakistan also, where as long as Pakistan and countries like Argentina are in good standing with the IMF, the Chinese will keep supporting this. But the Chinese have so far not come forward and told their borrowers how to run their economies. Like, they don't want to be in the business of what the IMF does, which is to increase taxes, cut down on subsidies, things like that. They don't want to do that. But it is only a matter of time before this entire balloon of debt it might get out of hand. And that's when the rubber will hit the road, as they say, and we'll have to see how China responds. This is the first time that China is facing a global debt crisis, and China has to learn that this is the cost of being a global leader and playing this big global game. You have to deal with these things.
Yeah, Dr. Ammar, Malik, it's quite interesting that you made a mention of Pakistan. Pakistan itself, as probably has been reported, that from 2001 till 2021, Pakistan borrowed around $70 billion from China. What does your research inform you in terms of how much of that debt, is still owed by Pakistan?
Some of the 70 billion that you're mentioning includes grants and loans. Only 2% of this entire portfolio is grants. And grants, in simple words, are money that you are not expected to repay. It's a gift, like the Gwadar airport. It's a $235 million gift to Pakistan. Most of these loans are given to Pakistan on the request of the government of Pakistan. It is very difficult for us to assess how much of this is actually owed to China. But because these projects, especially the energy projects, were given out or committed more than 7-8 years ago, their grace periods are over, which means that their honeymoon period, when you are not required to repay the loan, that is over. So Pakistan is now actively repaying in dollars money that it borrowed from Chinese power producers. And as you can imagine, with the balance of payments crisis that Pakistan has suffered over the last 2 years, this is creating tremendous pressure on the government to try to keep up with the payments. I know a few months ago, Pakistan created a revolving fund to keep some extra cash in dollars in an account to repay the circular debt. But this issue of circular debt has been going on for many, many months. I would say that Pakistan is the third largest recipient of Chinese development finance anywhere in the world. Pakistan has taken $28 billion from China just in the energy sector, which is the largest portfolio of energy anywhere in the world. Pakistan has also taken $10 billion from China in highways, which is also a big sector. And you've seen the improvements in highways all around the country. The drive from Lahore to Karachi has become much easier and so on. But what's happening now is that since 2018, big infrastructure investments have come down. And just like the global scene, Pakistan is now taking a lot of short-term debt. And most of that debt is unproductive debt, which means it is not being invested in projects that you and I can use. It is being invested simply to keep the system afloat and repay the loans that China and others had given Pakistan in the previous years. And that is really the challenge that Pakistan faces right now. And it's yet to be seen if the second or the third phase of the CPEC will actually become a reality. So far, all indications are that we've received the first phase of the projects through CPEC, build the infrastructure, but that infrastructure benefit in the second phase was supposed to translate into economic growth and productivity and job creation. That required the government of Pakistan to play its part in doing it, and that simply hasn't happened.
And so, are you seeing any trends towards more investment towards these special economic zones?
Certainly, there is, rhetorically, we hear the planning ministry talk at length about trying to build these special economic zones going. But more than the hardware of these special economic zones, I think we need to work on the software, which means how can we create the conditions that are conducive to a Chinese company to decide voluntarily to move to Rashakai near Peshawar, which is our special economic zone, rather than go to Cambodia or to Dubai or to Morocco. They have the whole world in front of them. So what can we do to create that competitive environment? And that competitive environment doesn't just come with plots of land and highways. It also requires supply chain controls, which means who are the companies who will supply goods to those factories? Do we have the engineers? What kind of engineers do we need? Where are they going to come from? And are all three levels of our government, local, provincial and national? Are they aligned with this strategy? And are we helping the investors come and do perhaps a one window operation or something where they're easily able to set up shop in Pakistan? Unfortunately, I don't see much movement in that direction, but I know that there are efforts underway and have been underway to try to make use of this opportunity. Remember that capitalists in China and anywhere in the world are pretty much the same. They will put their money where they see the returns. There was a time when the Chinese state was giving gifts to Pakistan, like the Lahore Orange Line project. It was a 2% interest rate, China Exim Bank loan, a government concessional loan, a gift. However, the private companies, I cannot expect Chinese private enterprise to give gifts of the same nature to Pakistan. Pakistan itself has to get its act together and become an attractive destination for them. And then perhaps the Chinese state's positive favorability toward Pakistan would come into play.
And so, Dr. Ammar Malik, let's speak about another South Asian country, and this is Sri Lanka. Where would you actually place the case study of Sri Lanka itself and deals like the Hambantota port? What would you really say? Was it because of the stirred as a result of poor economic decision making and political economy considerations by Sri Lankan decision makers, or was it due to the money that was owed to Chinese or Chinese lenders who were to be held responsible for this economic crisis?
Some, I'm not a Sri Lanka expert, to be honest, but I'll tell you what my understanding is. I think there's a lot of truth to what you just said about poor economic management, not taking the right decisions at the right time. There were also these allegations that there were a lot of money diverted to the home district of the Rajapaksas, including the Hambantota port. Of course, Hambantota became infamous around the world as an example, a shining example of the so-called debt trap diplomacy. But I think the same story that you're mentioning in Sri Lanka is playing out in bits and pieces all over the world. I think Zambia is a great example of that. Bangladesh is a great example of that, which is that when China finds a willing and able partner on the ground, especially a partner which has control over the entire government system, like the Rajapaksas had, or the Sheikh Hasina government has in Bangladesh right now, then that is the time when China doubles down. So in other words, when they have headwinds behind them, when they have headwinds in front of them, they lay low. And when they have tailwinds supporting them, then they double down. And I think that's what happened in the case of Sri Lanka. Certainly, this is what happened in Zambia. And we are going to see the same pattern play out in other countries.
Right. But, you were actually referring to this factor of nervous system itself. And don't you think the Chinese lenders themselves have sort of, learned and adapted, by looking at case studies like these, and would not want to invest their money in similar projects, which at the end of the day are not going to do or are unlikely to offer a good return on their own investments?
Absolutely. You're right. So if imagine you are in the State Council in China and looking at the dashboard of all the Chinese development projects, Belt and Road projects, you will see a lot of flashing red lights. And so in response, you can either try to reform your own institutions like the Exim Bank or China Development Bank to try to help them do better due diligence on projects, put better safeguards in place, or you could do a shortcut way, which I think is what they're doing, which is to start teaming up with entities that know how to do this. I'll give you a data point that might help you understand what I'm talking about. Half of all new lending coming out of China in 2021 came through syndicated loans. Now, syndicated loans are a consortium of lenders that is created. Sometimes it could have as many as 12, 14 different lenders. But what China is doing is they're putting one of the Western banks or the international financial institutions like the IFC or the World Bank as the lead arranger. And then they are all following the same guidelines that the lead arranger is putting in place as part of the consortium. So in other words, they're outsourcing the due diligence and safeguard mechanism. And mind you, 80% of the syndicate partners that Chinese banks are now working with are non-Chinese banks. And so another myth perhaps that I hope people will understand is still a myth is that the Belt and Road is no more an exclusively Chinese effort. it includes a lot of Western money as well, and Western banks. Again, following the same principle, money follows wherever there is return. So if you're an HSBC and a Standard Chartered, you know the Chinese state is backing a project and they're looking for a lead arranger, you will go in, sweep up whatever you can, and then try to create a financial product out of it and get all of your friends in the banking sector come and make use of it. And it is going to benefit China. It's also going to benefit the bank.
Dr. Ammar Malik, if we could actually speak of the recipient states also, what is it that they could also do to sort of, avoid going down the path where we've actually seen countries like Sri Lanka head to as a consequence, more or less as a consequence of, poor economic decision making by political leadership?
That's a very important point, Osama, and this is a point that is missed often in media coverage. What you're pointing to is, let me put it this way: there are two parties to every agreement. There's the borrower and there's the recipient, and we often forget that the borrower also has quite a lot of agency. As I said, China is also solving some domestic challenges related to overcapacity of financing and overcapacity of construction, in order to help developing countries. They're bringing all of this money forward, but the countries who are receiving it are also helping China with the problem that I just described. So there are two parties to every agreement, and I would argue that developing countries' governments must do a better job in doing proper due diligence. So when a new loan agreement, a term sheet comes to the desk of a debt manager or a Ministry of Finance official, the least that they should do is to do their due diligence and try to figure out what were the loan terms that the same Chinese creditor or other creditor offered my neighbor just 2 months ago when they were doing a similar project. All of that data is now available on 8Data's website, 8data.org. All you have to do is select the country and the project or the sector, and all the projects and the terms and conditions will come out. And of course, they already know what are the terms and conditions that Western banks will offer them, especially the international financial institutions will offer them. So I think they need to do more homework themselves before they sign up these projects. And we need to empower public accounts committees, parliamentary committees, and other oversight bodies whose job it is to make sure that we enter into good deals and not bad deals. I think we give far too less credit to developing country governments. I think we have a lot of agency in this.
Okay, Dr. Ammar Malik, now you're in the United States. Let's speak of the US itself. What has really been the conversation of lately, involving BRI and China itself? What do you think are the options available to the United States to, come up with either competing projects, or is there any pathway possible for the US itself to compete with China without getting confrontational about, China's BRI projects?
Osama, I think the gloves are off, as they say, and there is a very strong desire on the part of policy makers in Washington to put forward a competing initiative. In fact, they have already launched the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII. The European Commission has launched the Blue Dot Network. And if you combine the G7 development financing, again in the year 2021, they are way past China's $80 billion. I think there's something like $140 to $150 billion. Large part of this increase now has taken place in the United States, where the US used to hover around 35 to 50, $40 billion a year for many years. And as of 2021, the size of US overseas development financing has increased to 60 billion. And that $20 billion increase is coming mainly from just one agency, which is called the US Development Finance Corporation. And they are essentially doing the same sort of syndicated loans and big ticket infrastructure loans that China has been doing. And they're trying to put a competing offer on the table for developing countries. So that is obviously the US strategy at the moment. And if anything, they're doubling down on it. However, when we at 8Data run the listening to leaders surveys, these are elite surveys that we run in developing countries. It is very clear that developing country elites in Africa, Latin America, and Asia do not associate the US with quick infrastructure delivery. They want from the US scholarships, technical support on policies, and all the software of development. And when you ask them where would you go for hardware, they always say China because of the reasons I explained earlier. They are able to deliver very quickly. China has a state-owned enterprise system that will show up and build projects very quickly. So the challenge for the US and the West in general is that what they're trying to follow is a strategy of emulation. They are trying to copy what China is doing, but I think the Chinese are already doing it better than what they could offer in terms of speed, scale, and even safety, as I mentioned earlier. And I think they need to come up with a strategy of differentiation and also try to understand on a case to case basis what are the deficiencies in a country's development trajectory and how they can fill that in. Because, of course, the US has a long and rich history of engagements in a lot of developing countries with community organizations and NGOs and so on. How do you utilize that to put up a competing narrative against the Chinese offer is a huge challenge. And I think it's going to be continue to be a challenge in the foreseeable future.
Dr. Ammar Malik, it's quite interesting you make a mention of this. US has started emulating the Chinese approach. But if US is to do this differently, how do you really see policy planners or policymakers do it differently than China initially did it, or the way it has actually been pulling off right now? How differently would you really see the US do this going forward?
I think it's as I said, it's a tall order. It's very clear that the US sees, if you look at the national security strategy, the US sees China as the number one threat. And one of the theaters where this is going to play out is in the area of development finance. It also creates more influence for China on issues that China cares about, the so-called red lines that China has on Taiwan, on the issue of Xinjiang, and so on. And so the US is trying to continue to have the influence that it had over global institutions. Of course, the Chinese have launched the Global Civilization Initiative, the Global Development Initiatives, and other kind of multilateral type of initiatives where it's trying to create more space for itself and its policy position on these forums. And the truth is that China, being a developing country and working through the mechanism of South-South cooperation, if you notice, the Chinese don't use the word development, they use cooperation. They're basically saying, we are like you, we are a developing country, we know how it's done, we know how it's development done. 75% of all UN voting that we have looked at over the last 20 years, China's better aligned with developing countries than the US. And only 23% of the time, developing countries vote on the US position. The Israel-Gaza war that is going on right now is a good example of where the voting patterns are. So China has that advantage, but also you have to remember the US also controls the global financial system. I think less than 2 or 3% of all financial transactions are done in RMB. The US has a very powerful sanctions mechanism. When they decided to block Chinese Belt and Road projects in Iran, China tried its best to do all sorts of different things, even went as far as created its own bank. They just could not get money in to Iran. And I think the same might happen in Afghanistan because the Taliban government is under sanctions right now. And so my point is that the US still holds a lot of sway, a lot of influence over global institutions. It's not like China's already coming to the party and changing everything, but China is definitely putting a challenge forward. And I think the challenge for the West is that their competitive advantage is in software, soft power, and soft side of development around policy reforms and subsidy policies and scholarships. But what politicians in developing countries want to win elections is not that. They want that bridge, they want that tunnel, and they want to build a train so that they can go and tell their people, look, I have delivered development for you. And research has shown that these projects create a lot of goodwill for China in developing countries, and that strategy has been successful so far.
Dr. Ammar Malik, there's no area with sort of greater specter of confrontation between the US and China, as is the area of technological decoupling and de-risking. Let me then ask you, has China been reaching out to recipient states with financial investments, or is it lending money to recipient states in areas of tech, R&D, or areas that might be related to tech manufacturing? Have you really seen any trend towards that end?
Yeah, definitely. 2017 is when the Chinese government announced the so-called Digital Silk Road Initiative, which was an attempt to build connectivity between China and developing countries in the area of technology. Of course, AI, 4G, and now 5G has been a big part of it. We have seen in our data set dozens of smart city projects and safe city projects being funded by Huawei and ZTE and other Chinese companies. We have also seen China Telecom and other Chinese entities make major bets into telecom networks in places like Africa. So I definitely think that this digital avenue is a big part of what China is trying to do. Again, in the spirit of trying to solve the infrastructure shortcomings that developing countries have, and digital infrastructure is very much part and parcel of that. However, what we've also found is that there are a huge number of what we would call AI enabling technologies that are being exported through the Belt and Road. By AI enabling, I mean scanning technology. So X-ray scanning machines, CT scan machines, airport scanners, and others. Of course, the CCTV cameras and others are also part of it. And if you were to take a nefarious interpretation of what this is that in theory, at least, people who run those projects have access to a huge treasure trove of data on foreigners, and that they can use to improve the AI models. As you know, the greater the data is, the better the AI models are. So far, I have not seen evidence that this is being done in a big scale by China as a deliberate strategy. However, it is not beyond the realm of imagination that all of this data is being channeled into improving AI applications. However, we recently finished a report on this topic, and we found that when we look at the country level patterns of China's AI enabling and technology and ICT investments, we do not see that these investments are more likely to be in countries which have poorer human rights records or more likely to be in authoritarian governments which do not have democracies. It is just an evolving pattern that we are seeing that this is being done, but so far no discernible patterns or around this.
Dr. Ammar, Malik, let's speak of any future eventuality where, say, an African government reaches out to the United States and asks corporate companies, mostly in the sector of tech, to invest in their own domestic tech sector within those countries. And if there is any condition by the US government which sort of restricts US investors from investing in those areas simply for the fact because the Chinese have already invested their money, do you think a move like that would be helpful to the United States, its economy, and for its tech as well?
Obviously, Osama, this will depend on the market that we're talking about and whether US companies are already active in that. If it's a big market, let's say like a India or a Nigeria even or an Indonesia, it's going to be a much greater bet that the Americans would make. I know that there has been some confrontational posturing on semiconductors, chips, as well as trade over the last few years from the United States, and I'm not sure how effective those strategies have been in creating the conditions that the United States wants to create. However, I think that trying to decouple technologies is going to be not very beneficial for people who live in developing countries. And if you visit China, you realize that the world is already decoupled. The Chinese internet is very different from the American internet. Your Gmail doesn't work. Your Facebook doesn't work. Your WhatsApp is not working in China. They have their own platforms. And if that is going to play out in Africa and in Asia, and it's going to create two competing internets or two competing technology streams, I think ultimately the cost will have to be borne by people who live in developing countries because it will create a disincentive, as you're saying rightly, for an American or a Western company to invest in an environment that has already been captured by the other side. I certainly hope that it doesn't come to that, because my worry is that this is gonna create problems for companies who are trying to build new businesses in developing countries and recipients, people who are trying to use new technologies, and it might actually increase the digital divide between the global north and the global south.
And Dr. Ammar, Malik, my last question: what areas have you really seen, announced capital flow coming in from China? And particularly, I want to ask about the regions. Is it the region of Asia or is it Africa? And what projects specifically do you see receiving, such capital inflow? And if I may ask, if those particular projects are unlikely to go as planned, how could they really sort of influence, the global economy or the economies of those states?
So first of all, Sama, if you look at the global picture, Africa, Asia, and Latin America as being the three big regions of the global South are getting roughly 40% of outflows from China, which means that they are being done equally. Of course, each region has its own value proposition. So countries toward the northern part of Latin America, Ecuador, for example, or Panama, have enormous strategic value for China because they just happen to be the backyard of the US. The US traditionally has had a lot of influence over these countries, and so by investing in high quality or big ticket infrastructure, China is trying to compete against that. But one area where I'm watching very carefully, and I think we should all pay attention to, is the area of transition minerals or critical minerals. As you know, the world is moving toward a future where cobalt, lithium, and other transition minerals or critical minerals or rare earth minerals will be in high demand, and the supply is limited to a very few countries. So, for example, 70% of the world's cobalt reserves are in just one country, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and most of the lithium is in three countries of Latin America, and most of the nickel happens to be in Indonesia. So you will see more and more Chinese investments in mining operations. China has complete monopoly over processing of these minerals and then manufacturing of batteries. Even Tesla relies on Chinese manufacturers for batteries. Where they are still competing is influenced in the mining part of it, which is where it all starts. And we have already seen major new investments from Chinese companies into those sectors, and I see that that's going to happen a lot more. This is why Africa is going to remain very important. Southeast Asia is also going to remain very, very important. And to the other part of what you said about what's going to happen to the economies, I urge you all to read this fabulous new paper that was published by Carmen Reinhardt and co-authors. Carmen Reinhardt is a Harvard professor who was until recently the chief economist of the World Bank. It is called The Social Cost of Sovereign Default. And all developing countries which are now in debt distress should read that paper because they have documented the intergenerational, multi-decade impact that a sovereign default has on countries. So a country like Sri Lanka, which went through a very difficult economic period, even though it might seem that this is just financing things that we're talking about sitting in boardrooms and in central banks, it has very real impact on people because the prices of things go up. We saw in Sri Lanka people committing suicides and children going hungry. But what Carmen and co-authors have found in that paper is that the nutritional deficiencies and the learning disabilities that are generated as a result of that, for example, has impact on 2 or 3 generations. So we have to think very, very carefully about the impact that bad economic management might have on our populations. And I worry that people are insufficiently prepared in developing countries to deal with the trauma that might induce. Hence, this report and our data set is an effort to try to give more transparency on this issue. And we hope that through your platform and others that people will pay more attention to the details that I'm describing and hopefully make better decisions for the future.
Dr. Ammar Malik, I really appreciate you taking out the time and doing this interview with us with so much of dispassionate take and plenty of patience. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sama.
Thank you for joining us for this conversation with Dr. Ammar Malik. Our team works very hard to make this work possible, and it would mean the world to us if you could like and share our content. And if you'd like to stay informed about our podcast and other work, please hit the bell icon.